Now, in the second section of Chapter 15 on monetary policy, we're going to be taking a look at how the interest rates we discussed in the 15.1 section will be useful for monetary policy. So the first thing we're going to look at is the concept of changing interest rates. In other words, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, is going to use what's called a policy tool, meaning one of the methods to alter the supply of money that we talked about earlier, such as making discount loans to banks, the open market operations, changing the reserve requirements. All of those things make it possible to ultimately alter the supply of money. And then ultimately that will change the equilibrium interest rate. So let's take a look at our bullet statements. By increasing the money supply, thereby causing a surplus under the original conditions, the Fed will tend to lower the equilibrium rate of interest in order to reach equilibrium again. And the same thing is true on the opposite side. If the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply, that will trigger a shortage of money, and then of course the interest rate will rise. Now, we'll find out later on why the Federal Reserve would want to do these two things, but now we understand that the Federal Reserve can do it. In this particular slide, we're going to take a look graphically at what we're trying to accomplish. You notice in the vertical dotted line that we have here, that vertical dotted line was the same one we did in 15.1. Remember, the government had created G1 level of money supply, and then the equilibrium was at E1 because the demand for money was at 7%, and that got exactly, at 7%, got exactly the number of people who want to hold money equal to the amount that the Federal Reserve has created. So we were in equilibrium. However, what if the government wanted interest rates to be lower than 7%? Well, they can't be lower than 7% on their own because that's the equilibrium. That's the balance where people naturally gravitate to. So how do we get them to gravitate to a different interest rate? Well, in this case, you can see if we have this dotted line and we shift it horizontally to this dotted line, what does that mean? That means the government went from printing G1 level of money, now the government has printed G3 level of money. Let's put some numbers on here. Let's make this $1 billion. This is now $2 billion. So the government has doubled the amount of money in the system. So if they have, at 7% interest rates, will there be a surplus or a shortage of money now that the government has printed an extra billion? Well, of course, there'll be a surplus because at 7%, people only want to hold 1 billion. So how do we get them to hold the 2 billion that are in existence? Someone has to hold them, right? Well, as you can see, if there's a surplus of money, it drives down the interest rate to 6%. And at 6%, because the opportunity cost of holding cash rather than making an interest earning investment goes down, people are willing to hold more cash in their checking account at 6% than they were when the interest rates were 7%. So we have now established a new equilibrium at E3. So the whole point of this was to illustrate that the Federal Reserve could artificially drive down equilibrium interest rates from 7% to 6% by increasing the money supply. Now, in this particular slide, we're going to take a look at several different kinds of interest rates. We have been talking about on the previous slide as if there was only one interest rate. That was conceptual. Now we're going to take a look at the actual interest rates because it turns out that there are different markets for different kinds of loans, and therefore there isn't just one interest rate. There's a separate interest rate for every different kind of loan that's possible. We're not going to go through an entire list of all the loans that are possible. We'll just pull out a few of them that are quite popular. The first one is going to be the Fed funds rate, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. Remember, federal funds are loans between banks of excess reserves from one bank is being lent to a bank that has deficient amount of reserves to make sure that that bank also has enough reserves on hand that they're not violating the reserve requirement. And that is one of the cheapest loans that there is. They're usually only for overnight, maybe a day or two, and super secure because they're lending from one bank to another bank. And so generally speaking, the interest rate on Fed funds is about as low as interest rates go. About one, as you can see, back in 2020, that was 1.1%. Now, the next rate on our list is the discount rate. Remember, the discount rate is the rate that the Federal Reserve charges to banks if the banks borrow money in order to cover their reserves. Now, the discount rate is higher than the Fed funds rate, so under normal conditions, banks usually prefer to go to other bankers to borrow to cover their reserve requirements. But if they had to, they could go to the Federal Reserve and do it at a higher interest rate. The next one down at 4.25% in 2020 was the prime rate. The prime rate is the interest rate banks charge to their blue chip companies. Now, blue chip usually means the highest credit quality. Companies like Home Depot, for instance, would be a blue chip company. And banks fall all over themselves to lend money to Home Depot because the chances of Home Depot defaulting, considering how profitable they are, is very, very rare, right? So banks are willing to do that. So back in 2020, it took 4.25% to get a bank willing to lend to Home Depot. Mortgage rates actually were lower than interest rates that Home Depot could borrow at, which is quite surprising to many people. But don't forget, the loan to Home Depot is unsecured, which means that if Home Depot ever did go bankrupt, the banker is not in a very good position to do a repossession because they don't have any security on that loan. Whereas for a mortgage loan, obviously they have your house as collateral. So it turns out that mortgages, at least made under traditional standards of, a person putting money down, having good credit, the chances of a default are very, very low. So banks are willing to lend at only 3.75% to homeowners. Auto loans, there's still something you can repossess, but unlike houses, which go up in value, cars only go down in value. So when a car gets repossessed, oftentimes there's not enough value in the car to cover the full value of the loan. So banks oftentimes do lose money on car loans when cars default. So naturally they charge a higher premium to make the car loan than they do to make the safer home loan. And then the next one is consumer loans in general. These are unsecured consumer loans, not a second mortgage, because a second mortgage will be closer to the first mortgage. If the bank knows they can get your house if you don't make the payments, they generally are quite secure in their knowledge you'll make the payments. But on a regular consumer installment credit, like let's say buying a washing machine and a dryer combo, and you take out a loan for that, there's not much to repossess there, and so generally speaking, those loans have high interest rates. And then of course the highest ones of all would be credit card loans, because there's literally nothing to repossess. When you use a credit card and you buy a meal, obviously there's no way to get that meal out of you. So, the bank is out of luck. If you ever default on your credit card, there's, other than, destroying your credit, I mean, there is some reason to pay your credit cards. They can't physically go after you very easily. Whereas with car loans and home loans, of course, the bank can repossess the physical object. The point I want you all to recognize here is every one of these is a separate market, but they share the overarching concept of what we were talking about with the money market. So we still have the issue of interest rates, supply and demand, setting the interest rates that are in these particular markets. So now let's get to interest rates and spending. Because remember, this whole point of this particular chapter is to talk about monetary policy, and monetary policy means the government deliberately manipulating these interest rates and manipulating the money supply to change the interest rates to change people's spending. So let's talk about how we do that. So, starting off with our slide, a tactic of monetary stimulus. And why would you want to do that? First of all, what does monetary stimulus mean? This means we're going to use money to stimulate the economy. When would we want to do that? Let's assume the economy is starting to go into a recession. Workers are getting laid off. Companies are starting to declare bankruptcy. This is not a good thing, right? So we want to stimulate the total amount of business being done in the economy through aggregate demand. Remember, we did that way earlier in another chapter. Aggregate demand is the total amount of demand for all goods and services in the economy. If we can lower interest rates and get people to spend more money because of lower interest rates, then maybe we can change the aggregate demand. Well, let's think about what lowering interest rates might do. We can see here they can reduce the cost of investment spending. Well, it's pretty obvious. Let's use an example. You are a contractor and you've been thinking about buying another backhoe for your construction company. They cost $100,000. You can't just write a check for it, so you're going to go, because you don't have the money to do it, so you need to go borrow, let's say, $80,000 of the $100,000. And if interest rates are 10%, that's $8,000 a year worth of interest. Not cheap. What if interest rates were only 3%? then it'd only be $3,000 worth of interest every year. So clearly, the lower the interest rate would be, the more likely you as a business person would go out to make an investment in your equipment. Okay, so that's just the basic idea, that if interest rates go down, business people will invest more. And then, of course, the cost of holding inventory goes down. If you're Home Depot and you've been thinking about holding, let's say normally you hold 1,000 board feet of 2x4s in every store. If interest rates are really, really low and Georgia Pacific offers you a deal, if you buy 2,000 board feet for every store, we'll make you a special deal. If interest rates are super low, then of course Home Depot, it would be in their interest to go borrow the money and go stock up on inventory to get the better deal. So my point, of course, is that we realize business people will change the total amount of investment in new machinery and the amount of inventory they hold if interest rates are very low. So the investment spending and the building up of inventory can kick off what's called a positive multiplier effect. In other words, picture in your mind, Home Depot buys an extra load of 2x4s from Georgia Pacific. Therefore, Georgia Pacific now has to reactivate the third shift at night to bring enough people in order to run the saws to make those extra 2x4s. Those workers all now get a paycheck. They decide to go buy a new car, so then workers at General Motors now have a job, and you can see that would now start to course through the entire economy. So the Federal Reserve would try to stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates, and that would kick off either an increased investment spending or increased inventory spending. Now, in this slide, we're going to take a look at pictures of what I just said in words. Let's start off with the first slide on the far left. This is the money market. Now, we already worked through the argument for why equilibrium 1 exists. The Federal Reserve has printed a certain amount of money in the past. We have a demand for it. At E1, we're in balance. 7% interest gets the right number of people to keep the money in their checking account as cash, is exactly equal to the amount of cash that the government has printed up. Now, let's assume that the economy slides into a recession and the government wants to stimulate the aggregate demand. So, what could we do? In this example, what we're going to do is, as we can see in the picture, we're going to increase the money supply, so the new equilibrium is at a much lower interest rate, 6%. Now let's go to the next slide, the next graph in the slide. As we can see, this is the investment demand. Does everybody agree that at high interest rates, only this amount of investment, in other words, this many pieces of equipment would be purchased, but if interest rates were lower at 6%, then business people would like to buy more equipment? Well, that should make perfect common sense, and that's exactly what we're doing. So now that we've driven interest rates down from 7% down to 6%, what happens to the total number of dollars of investment? They go from I1 up to I2. So, as business people are spending more money on new equipment, then obviously workers go back to work, and what happens to the total demand? It goes from aggregate demand in the system of that, and it now shifts it out to aggregate demand curve 2, which means the total economy has grown, and that puts people back to work. So that would be the underlying theory. So it's basically a 3-step theory. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply, drives down the interest rate. The lower interest rate stimulates investment. The stimulated investment increases the aggregate demand for goods and services in the economy. The economy recovers. So that would be an example of monetary stimulus, or a policy of monetary stimulus where the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. Now, of course, they could obviously do everything what I just said in reverse. Now, we're not going to draw the graphs in this particular slide. This is just a reminder that if the Federal Reserve decided the economy is growing too rapidly, we're overheating, in other words, inflation's starting to rise too quickly, and we want to slow the economy down a little bit, what could the Federal Reserve do? In that case, to slow the economy down, you would do monetary restraint. And that would mean we would increase, or rather we would decrease the money supply. That would cause a shortage of cash. That would drive up interest rates. As interest rates go up, business people making a decision about investing in new equipment, or a homeowner thinking about buying a new house, they get discouraged because of the high interest rates. They cut back on the amount that they buy. What does that do to total aggregate demand in the system? obviously, if people are buying less stuff, then the total aggregate demand goes down, and that slows the economy down a little bit. Now, we don't want to do it too much, but if the economy is overheating, we want to bring it down to a more sustainable pace that we could maintain, for a much longer period of time. So the Federal Reserve now, we've gone through two different things the Federal Reserve could do. They could either stimulate the economy or they could restrain the economy by either printing more money and increasing the money supply or reducing the amount of money supply. So here's our summary. To stimulate the economy, let's increase the money supply. That leads to lower interest rates. That leads to increased investment. That leads to an increase in aggregate demand. That would be a method for stimulating the economy. And of course, we'll do the exact same thing in reverse. We're just not going to bother saying it because you could simply work it in the opposite direction. So let's move on to the next slide, the next set of slides.